Devil King of the Corporate World. Chapter 1, The Heir of Asterix. Shanghai's financial district rarely slept. Even past midnight, lights still burned inside the skyscrapers that dominated the skyline. Markets in New York had opened, European investors were still trading, and corporations across Asia continued negotiating deals. Near the center of the district stood a black glass tower. At the entrance of the building was a silver symbol engraved into stone. ASTRYX Global Consortium. Few companies in the world held influence comparable to Asterix. Technology, logistics, investment funds, pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence. Asterix had gradually expanded into nearly every major industry over the past 50 years. The company had been founded by a man named Wang Gaojian, a former factory worker who built a global empire through relentless ambition. Now the company stood at the peak of the corporate world, and the person currently controlling most of its power was his grandson, George Wang. Across international financial circles, he had earned a nickname, the Devil King of the Corporate World. Not because of arrogance, but because of results. Companies that opposed Asterix rarely survived long. A meeting no one wanted. Inside a quiet conference room on the top floor, several executives sat stiffly around a large table. A presentation screen displayed falling stock prices. A middle-aged CEO stood near the screen, wiping sweat from his forehead. Our company experienced unexpected market fluctuations this quarter, he said. No one responded. At the end of the table sat a young man flipping through a financial report. Black hair, sharp features, a calm expression that revealed very little. George Wang, the CEO, continued nervously. If Asterix could extend the cooperation contract for another year, we can recover the losses and... George closed the report. The sound echoed slightly in the quiet room. You transferred our prototype software to Zhonghai Tech. The CEO froze. I can explain. George looked at him. His voice remained level. You failed to sell it. The man's face turned pale. But the deal never happened. There was no real damage. George stood. That's because our security team intervened. He slid a document across the table. Asterix will terminate all cooperation with your company effective immediately. The CEO's legs weakened. Please reconsider. Thousands of employees depend on this partnership. George paused briefly before walking toward the door. Your decisions put them in that position. Then he left. The executives remained silent. The nickname Devil King hadn't appeared without reason. The Wang residence. About 40 minutes outside the city center stood the Wang family estate. The property covered several acres and was surrounded by tall trees and iron gates. Security guards monitored the entrance. Inside the main building, several household staff members were still working despite the late hour. A black car stopped in front of the entrance. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Young master, we've arrived. George stepped out. The front door opened immediately. A man in his 60s greeted him. His posture was straight and his suit perfectly pressed. Welcome home, young master. This was Butler Liang. He had served the Wang family for more than 30 years and had once worked directly under George's grandfather. How was your grandfather today? George asked. He spent the afternoon in the garden, Liang replied. His health was stable. George nodded. Inside the residence, several maids quietly finished preparing the dining room. The atmosphere felt calm, unlike the aggressive environment of the corporate world. A moment later, two voices echoed from the living room. You're finally home. George's older sister stood near the stairs. Wang Liu. She wore a formal coat and held a tablet under her arm. Liu was not involved in Asterix operations. Instead, she was a cardiovascular surgeon at one of Shanghai's most prestigious hospitals. Her schedule was even more exhausting than George's. You're still awake, George said. I just got back from surgery, she replied. Before he could say more, someone jumped onto the sofa nearby. You both look like exhausted old people. That was the youngest sister, Wang Meilan, a university student studying architecture. She grinned. Grandfather was asking about you earlier. George walked toward the dining table. Is he still awake? Probably reading in his study, Meilan said. George nodded slightly. Despite the family's immense wealth, their home life remained relatively ordinary. Meals together, conversations about daily routines, occasional arguments between siblings. Many wealthy families gradually grew distant. The Wang family had managed not to. The founder. Later that night, George walked down a quiet hallway. At the end of it was a study room with dim light inside. He knocked once. Come in. An elderly man sat behind a wooden desk. His hair had turned completely white, but his eyes remained sharp. Wang Gaojian, founder of Asterix, the man who built the empire from nothing. George stepped inside. You should be resting. The old man chuckled. At my age, sleep becomes optional. He placed a book aside. How did the Zhonghai situation end? I terminated cooperation. Good. The old man studied his grandson for a moment. You're becoming more decisive. George didn't respond. Gaojian leaned back. The business world is full of people who will betray you for profit. I know. The old man nodded slowly. Just remember one thing. George looked up. Never let that make you distrust everyone. George said nothing, because that had already happened. Chen Ruoxiu. The next afternoon, George arrived at Asterix headquarters. His assistant informed him someone was waiting in his office. When he opened the door, he saw a familiar figure standing near the window. Chen Ruoxiu. She turned slightly. You still don't lock your office. Her tone carried mild amusement. Ruoxiu came from the Chen family, another influential business family in Shanghai. She and George had known each other since childhood. Their parents had been close friends. But unlike George's controlled personality, Ruoxiu had always been more direct. You should inform reception before entering, George said. She shrugged. They know me. She studied him for a moment. You've been working too much again. It's normal. Ruoxiu didn't argue. Instead, she walked toward the desk and placed a document there. The Chen Group is planning a joint logistics project with Asterix. George glanced at it briefly. I'll review it. She nodded. For a moment neither of them spoke. Ruoxu understood something others often didn't. George rarely trusted people outside his family. Not because he hated them, but because he expected betrayal eventually. Even so, she remained his closest friend outside the Wang household. Before leaving, she paused at the door. You should take a break occasionally. George didn't answer. Ruoxu left quietly. She never mentioned the feelings she had carried for years, because she already knew the answer. The small restaurant. A week later George left the office unusually late. Traffic in the financial district had already thinned. Instead of heading directly home, he took a longer route through older parts of the city. These areas had narrower streets and older buildings. The noise of the commercial center faded. At one intersection he stopped the car because of a temporary road closure. While waiting, he noticed a narrow alley nearby. At the corner of it was a small restaurant. The wooden sign above the door had faded slightly from age. Inside, only one light was on. There were no customers. George glanced at the clock in his car. He had another 30 minutes before the road reopened. After a brief pause, he stepped out. Inside the restaurant, the space was simple. 4 tables, a counter near the kitchen entrance. A young woman stood behind the counter writing something in a notebook. She looked up when the door opened. You're still open? George asked. Yes. Her tone was calm. George sat at one of the tables. What do you serve? Noodles, rice dishes. He nodded once. Anything simple. She disappeared into the kitchen. About 10 minutes later she returned with a bowl of noodles and placed it on the table. George ate slowly. The food was decent. Nothing extraordinary. But the place was quiet. No music. No conversations. Just the occasional sound of traffic outside. When he finished, he placed money on the table. What's your name? He asked before leaving. Aveline. She wiped the counter with a cloth. Aveline Yue. George nodded slightly. Then he left. He didn't think about the restaurant again that night. But over the next week, he returned several times. Not because of the food. And not because of the girl. Simply because the place was quiet. In a city filled with constant noise and negotiation. That small restaurant offered something rare. Silence.
Chapter 2. A quiet corner of the city. George Wang's schedule rarely changed. He woke up at 6 in the morning. Breakfast was usually brief, tea, eggs, and whatever the kitchen staff prepared that day. The Wang residence had more than 20 staff members working on the property. Most of them had served the family for years. They knew their responsibilities and rarely needed instructions. That morning the dining table was already prepared when George entered. 2 maids quietly stepped aside. Butler Liang stood near the door as usual. Good morning, young master. George nodded slightly. Good morning. His younger sister Meilin was already sitting at the table scrolling through her phone. You look half asleep, she said. George poured himself tea. You say that every morning. That's because it's true. Meilin looked toward the hallway. Grandfather already went to the garden. A moment later Liu walked in wearing a dark coat. She looked like she hadn't slept much. Night shift again? George asked. Emergency surgery, she replied. She sat down and rubbed her temples. The family talked briefly about small things, Meilin's university project, a new hospital policy that annoyed Liu, and an upcoming charity event their grandfather was attending. It was a normal morning. For people who controlled billions in corporate assets, their breakfast conversations were surprisingly ordinary. Asterix headquarters. By 8:30 George was already in the financial district. Asterix Global Consortium's headquarters tower reflected the morning sunlight across its dark glass surface. Inside the building, employees moved quickly between departments. Meetings began early here. George walked through the lobby without slowing down. Executives passing by greeted him quietly. Good morning, young master. Morning. His assistant followed a few steps behind, handing him a tablet. There are 3 board meetings today, 2 acquisition reviews, and the Singapore Investment Conference call. George glanced at the schedule. Move the second meeting to tomorrow. Yes, sir. Inside his office he spent the next several hours reviewing reports. Asterix was preparing to acquire a European logistics company. Another project involved expanding an artificial intelligence research division. By early afternoon the negotiations had already eliminated 2 competing bidders. George handled decisions quickly. He rarely wasted time discussing possibilities that wouldn't succeed. This efficiency was exactly why the company's executives respected him, even if they sometimes feared him. Chen Ruozu's observation. Around 3 in the afternoon, Chen Ruoxue entered the building. She greeted the receptionist before taking the elevator to the executive floor. When she walked into George's office, he was still reading financial data. You didn't answer my message yesterday, she said. George looked up briefly. I was working. That's your usual answer. She sat across from his desk. Ruaoshui had already grown used to his short responses. Still, something felt slightly different lately. "You've been leaving the office earlier this week," she said. George continued reading. "Not particularly. Earlier than midnight counts as earlier." He didn't respond. Ruaoshui leaned back slightly. She had known him long enough to notice small changes. For someone like George, routine was almost absolute. But recently that routine had shifted a little. She didn't know why yet. Evening in the old district. That night George left the financial district at around 10. Instead of taking the highway toward the Wang residence, he turned toward the older part of the city again. The streets here were quieter. Most office workers had already gone home. The small alley looked the same as before. A single light was on inside the restaurant. George parked the car nearby and walked in. The same young woman stood behind the counter. She glanced at him briefly. "You're back." George sat at the same table as last time. Yes. She didn't ask anything else. Instead she walked into the kitchen. A few minutes later a bowl of noodles appeared in front of him. The place remained quiet. There were still no customers. After finishing the meal, George asked a simple question. "Business is slow." Aveline wiped the counter again. "This street doesn't get much traffic. Why stay here?" She paused for a moment before answering. "Rent is cheap." George nodded. That explanation made sense. He placed the payment on the table and left. The conversation had lasted less than a minute. A routine without intention. Over the next several days the pattern repeated. Late at night George occasionally drove through the same area. Sometimes he entered the restaurant. Sometimes he didn't. When he did, the interaction remained minimal. He ordered food. Aveline cooked it. They rarely exchanged more than a few sentences. It was not the kind of place people visited for atmosphere or popularity. But the quiet environment made it easier to clear his mind after long negotiations and corporate conflicts. George treated it almost like a temporary pause between two worlds. Something unusual. One night, while finishing his meal, George noticed something slightly strange. Two men stood across the street near the alley entrance. They weren't entering the restaurant. They were simply watching the street. George didn't stare long enough to attract attention. After a moment he looked down at his phone again. When he left the restaurant 15 minutes later, the men were gone. He didn't think about it immediately. But his instincts remembered the detail. The Chen family dinner. 2 days later the Wang family attended a formal dinner hosted by the Chen family. The Chen estate was smaller than the Wang residence but still impressive. Ruaoshui greeted them at the entrance. "You're late," she told George. "Traffic." Inside the dining hall both families exchanged polite conversation. George's grandfather and Ruizu's father discussed international trade policies. Meilin talked with Ruaoshui about university life. Liu asked questions about a new hospital research program funded by the Chen Group. At one point Ruaoshui stepped outside onto the balcony. George followed a few minutes later. "You don't like large gatherings," she said. "I tolerate them." She looked at the city lights in the distance. "You've seemed distracted recently." George leaned against the railing. "Work." Ruaoshui studied him for a moment but didn't press further. She had learned long ago that forcing answers from George rarely worked. Back at the restaurant. Later that night George drove through the old district again. The restaurant light was still on. Inside, Aveline was organizing boxes near the kitchen. "You're open late," he said. "Cleaning." He sat down anyway. "I'll take whatever you're making." She nodded and went back to the stove. After placing the bowl on the table, she returned to sorting supplies. George noticed several invoices on the counter. Some of them were overdue. "You handle this place alone?" he asked. "Yes." "No staff?" She shook her head. "Too expensive." George finished eating and stood up. Before leaving, he glanced once more at the quiet restaurant. Small space. Almost no customers. Yet she continued running it alone. It wasn't something most people would choose. But he didn't ask further. Instead he stepped outside and walked toward his car. Across the street, someone stood in the shadows near the alley entrance. George noticed the figure immediately. This time the person didn't disappear. They simply watched him. George opened the car door calmly. The moment he sat inside, the figure turned and walked away into the darkness. George's expression remained unchanged. But his mind had already registered the pattern. 2 appearances. Same location. Same late hours. It might have been coincidence. Or it might not. Either way, someone was paying attention to that quiet little corner of the city. And George had just become part of it. Chapter 3, A Change in Tone. The following morning at the Wang residence began like most others. The sky outside was still pale when the estate staff started their routines. In the kitchen, 2 cooks prepared breakfast while a maid arranged the dining table. The quiet rhythm of the household had been the same for years. George entered the dining room a little after 6. Butler Liang was already waiting near the doorway. Good morning, young master. Morning. George poured tea and sat down. A few minutes later his younger sister Meilin walked in, still tying her hair. You're early today, she said. I always am. That's not true, she replied. Sometimes you're just less late. George ignored the comment. Liu joined them soon after, carrying a small stack of hospital files. You brought work to breakfast? Mei Lin asked. Research notes, Liu replied. There's a conference next week. As a cardiovascular surgeon, most of Liu's time was spent in operating rooms or medical research. She rarely had free time, but she seemed to prefer it that way. Their grandfather entered the room shortly afterward. Despite his age, Wang Gujun still carried himself with the confidence of the man who built asterisks from nothing. Everyone awake already? He said. Mei Lin isn't, Liu replied. I am too. The old man chuckled and sat down. Breakfast conversations remained light. Most of them avoided discussing corporate matters unless necessary. But when George finished his tea, Gujun suddenly asked. You've been leaving the financial district through the south route recently. George looked up. His grandfather noticed things easily. It's quieter, George said. Gujun nodded once. He didn't ask anything else. Asterisk security. Later that day, George called someone into his office. A tall man entered and closed the door behind him. His name was Shu Ren. He headed Asterisk's internal security division. Unlike typical corporate security departments, Asterisk's unit handled intelligence gathering, cyber investigations, and risk assessments across multiple countries. George slid a small note across the desk. Location. Shu Ren read the address. A restaurant. An alley nearby. Problem. Possibly. George leaned back in his chair. I saw the same individuals watching the area twice. Shu Ren nodded slowly. Corporate rivals. Unlikely. George tapped the desk lightly. But verify. Understood. Shu Ren stood. We'll investigate quietly. Asterix rarely reacted loudly to potential threats. Information came first. Action followed later. The old district again. That evening George finished work slightly earlier than usual. The drive through Shanghai was smooth. Night traffic had thinned, and the older districts were quieter than the financial center. When he reached the alley, the restaurant light was on again. Inside, Aveline Yu stood near the counter organizing ingredients. She looked up briefly. You're here again. George sat down. Yes. She walked toward the kitchen but stopped halfway. You always order the same thing. George looked at her. I ordered twice. That's enough to form a pattern. Her tone was casual. George noticed the difference immediately. During his earlier visits she had spoken only when necessary. Now her tone sounded less guarded. What do you recommend? He asked. She leaned slightly against the counter. That depends. On what? Whether you're someone who eats normally or someone who orders expensive food everywhere and then complains when simple food tastes simple. George considered that for a moment. Normal food is fine. Good, she said. Because that's all I have. She disappeared into the kitchen. The restaurant was still empty. After a few minutes she returned with a plate of fried rice instead of noodles. Trying something different, she said. George took a bite. It was good. Better than the noodles, actually. You've improved, he said. She raised an eyebrow. That sounded like criticism disguised as a compliment. It wasn't criticism. She wiped the counter again but seemed less tense than before. After a moment she said. You work nearby. Financial district. That explains the suit. George didn't respond. She glanced at him briefly. You're very quiet. I talk when necessary. That must make meetings interesting. He finished the meal and stood up. Thank you. You say that every time. Is that a problem? No. She took the payment and placed it in the register. Before George left, she said something unexpected. Sorry if I seemed unfriendly the first few times you came. George paused. Why? She hesitated slightly before answering. This place is quiet at night. That's obvious. And sometimes people assume that means they can behave however they want. George understood the implication. You had trouble with customers. A few. Recently. Last year. She shrugged. So now I keep conversations short until I know someone isn't a problem. George nodded once. That's reasonable. It was a practical explanation. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just experience. Chen Ruoxue notices something. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Chen Ruoxue sat inside her office reviewing a logistics report. Her assistant knocked and entered. Miss Chen, the Asterix meeting has been scheduled for Thursday. All right. The assistant hesitated. There's something else. Ruoxue looked up. What? The transportation team mentioned something odd. What kind of odd? They saw President Wang's car several times in the old Nanchao district late at night. Ruoxue frowned slightly. That area isn't part of any Asterix project. No. Are you sure? Yes. Ruoxue leaned back in her chair. George rarely went anywhere without a reason. If he had started visiting a particular place repeatedly, it meant something had caught his attention. She didn't know what yet. But she intended to find out. Asterix security report. Late that night Xu Ren returned to George's office. We completed a preliminary check. And the two men you saw aren't connected to Asterix competitors. George waited. They're small-time debt collectors. For who? Xu Ren handed him a document. The building owner. George read it briefly. Explain. The restaurant in that alley is behind on rent. George looked up. How much? 3 months. Xu Ren continued. The owner recently hired collectors to pressure the tenant. George closed the document. Legal. Technically. George thought for a moment. Then he said calmly. Keep watching. Xu Ren nodded. Yes, sir. A small corner of the city. The next night George returned again. The restaurant looked the same as always. Quiet. 4 tables. Warm light. Aveline was carrying a box of vegetables when he entered. You again, she said. That seems to surprise you. A little. Why? Most people don't return to places with no customers. George sat down. I prefer quiet places. She placed the vegetables near the kitchen. Then you found the right one. He looked around the empty restaurant. You could attract more customers. How? Better location. She laughed lightly. That requires money. George didn't respond. Instead he asked. Do you plan to stay here long? Until I figure out something better. That sounds uncertain. It is. She leaned against the counter again. But uncertainty is cheaper than failure. George studied her for a moment. She seemed younger than he first assumed. Maybe mid-20s. Running a restaurant alone in a quiet district wasn't easy. Yet she didn't complain about it. Before leaving, George noticed something through the front window. 2 unfamiliar men were walking slowly toward the restaurant. He recognized them immediately. The same men from earlier. Debt collectors. George said nothing. But he remained seated. For the first time since he started coming here, the quiet routine of that small corner restaurant was about to change. Chapter 4 Unwelcomed Visitors. The 2 men outside the restaurant didn't rush. They walked slowly down the alley as if they had done this many times before. One of them was tall and thin with a leather jacket, while the other had a heavier build and carried himself with the casual confidence of someone used to intimidating people. George noticed them through the glass window but didn't react. Across the counter, Aveline was washing a few dishes in the small sink. The sound of running water filled the quiet room. The door opened. The small bell above it rang once. Aveline glanced up. Her expression changed slightly when she saw who had entered. The taller man walked straight to the counter. Evening. His voice was relaxed, but there was something unpleasant behind the tone. Aveline dried her hands with a towel. You're early this week. Business is slow everywhere, the man replied. So we decided to visit earlier. The second man leaned against one of the empty tables and looked around the restaurant. Still no customers, he said. Aveline didn't respond to that. The tall man placed both hands on the counter. 3 months. I know. Then you also know the landlord isn't very patient anymore. Aveline opened the register drawer briefly and took out a small envelope. She pushed it across the counter. Half of this month. The man opened the envelope and counted the money. He sighed. This doesn't solve the problem. It keeps the problem from growing. The heavier man laughed quietly from behind. You should find another job, he said. This place isn't exactly thriving. Aveline's voice stayed calm. I'll manage. The tall man slid the envelope into his pocket. Next week we expect the rest. He turned to leave but paused when he noticed George sitting at the table. He had almost forgotten someone else was there. The man studied him briefly. You're the only customer she's had tonight. George didn't answer. The man shrugged and walked toward the door. See you next week. Both men left the restaurant. The bell rang again as the door closed. Silence again. The restaurant returned to its usual quiet. Aveline resumed wiping the counter as if nothing unusual had happened. George finished the last of his tea. You're behind on rent. She didn't look up. You heard that? Yes. It happens. 3 months is more than, it happens. Aveline leaned slightly against the counter. Opening a restaurant takes more money than people think. That's obvious. She glanced at him. You don't seem surprised. I see businesses fail often. That sounds optimistic. It's realistic. Aveline considered that answer for a moment before asking. What kind of work do you do? Investment. That explains the calm attitude toward failure. George didn't reply. She put the cleaning cloth aside. Anyway, the situation isn't as bad as it sounds. You're still operating. Exactly. George stood and placed money on the table. Before leaving he said, you should negotiate with the landlord directly. I tried. And he prefers sending those too. George nodded once. Then he walked out. Asterix investigation. The following morning Shu Ren entered George's office again. We confirmed the landlord's identity. George looked up from his laptop. Continue. He owns several old properties in that district. Most of them are rented to small businesses. Financial situation. Stable. Why push that restaurant so aggressively? Shu Ren handed him another document. The building might be sold soon. George scanned the page. A redevelopment project. Yes. Who's buying the land? We're still investigating. George closed the document. Find out. Shu Ren nodded. Chen Ruizu's visit. That evening Chen Ruoxue drove through the Nanchao district herself. Her assistant had been correct. The area looked older and quieter than the financial center. After a few minutes she noticed the small restaurant at the corner of the alley. The lights were on. She parked across the street. Through the window she saw someone sitting inside. George Ruoxue watched silently for a moment. It wasn't surprising that he occasionally visited random places. What surprised her was the repetition. George rarely returned to the same place without purpose. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the restaurant. Inside, George had just finished eating when the door opened. He looked up. Ruoxue. She glanced around the small room. So this is where you disappear to at night. Aveline, standing behind the counter, looked between them. You know each other? Yes, Ruoxue replied. George didn't elaborate. Ruoxue sat down across from him. I drove around half the district before finding this place. It's not easy to notice. That's obvious. She studied the restaurant briefly. Quiet. That's the point. Aveline walked over with a menu. What would you like? Ruoxue looked up at her. Whatever he ordered. Fried rice. Then that. Aveline returned to the kitchen. Ruoxue leaned forward slightly. You come here often. Occasionally. That's not how your driver described it. George didn't respond. Ruoxue smiled faintly. I'm not criticizing. She glanced toward the kitchen. Just curious. Aveline brought the plate a few minutes later. Ruoxue tasted the food. It's good. Thank you. After a short silence, Ruoxue said something casually. You run this place alone. Yes. That's difficult. Sometimes. Ruoxue nodded. Running a business alone required determination. Even a small restaurant demanded constant work. When they finished eating, Ruoxue and George left together. Outside the restaurant she said. You like the quiet? Yes. She looked back at the building once. That place won't stay open long. Why? The entire block is rumored to be sold for redevelopment. George glanced at her. You heard that already. Chen Group monitors city real estate projects. George said nothing. Ruoxue noticed his silence. You're thinking about something. Maybe. She smiled slightly. You always are. The next week. Over the following days the investigation continued. Shu Ren eventually returned with new information. The redevelopment project is led by a company called Hengdao Holdings. George looked up immediately. Hengdao. Yes. George leaned back in his chair. Hengdao Holdings wasn't a major corporation. But it had recently received significant investment from unknown sources. Who's backing them? George asked. We're still tracing the funding. George tapped the desk lightly. Keep digging. Shu Ren nodded. Understood. A simple question. That night George visited the restaurant again. Aveline was preparing ingredients for the next day. You're closing early, he said. Cleaning. She looked at him. You've been coming here a lot. You noticed. It's a small room. Hard not to. George sat down anyway. Do you know the building may be redeveloped soon? She paused. Yes. That doesn't concern you. It does. Then why stay? Aveline shrugged slightly. Because until someone actually tells me to leave, this place is still mine. George studied her quietly. Then he asked one final question. If you had the choice, would you move somewhere else? She thought about it for a moment. Probably. Why haven't you? She gave a small smile. Because choices usually require money. George didn't respond. But for the first time since he discovered the restaurant, he began considering the situation as more than just a quiet place to eat. Somewhere in the background, a real estate project was starting. Debt collectors were applying pressure. And a small restaurant in a forgotten corner of the city was standing directly in the middle of it. George rarely involved himself in small matters. But sometimes small matters revealed much larger ones. Chapter 5. A developing pattern. George Wong was not a man of habits. Most of his routines existed because efficiency demanded them, not because he preferred them. His days were carefully scheduled: meetings, negotiations, strategy sessions. Even his personal time usually had a purpose. But over the past 2 weeks, something small had changed. After leaving Asterix headquarters late at night, he occasionally drove toward the Nanchao district. The narrow alley. The quiet restaurant. A simple meal before heading home. He didn't think about it much. It simply happened. The Wong residence. Early that morning the Wong estate was already active. Gardeners worked near the entrance while several maids prepared the breakfast room. George entered wearing a dark coat. Butler Liang greeted him. Young master. George nodded. Morning. His grandfather was already seated at the table reading a newspaper. You've been leaving the office earlier lately, the old man said without looking up. Sometimes. That's good. George poured tea. Why? Because working all night every day eventually makes people careless. George didn't respond. Liu joined them a moment later, looking more awake than usual. No emergency surgeries today, she said, sitting down. Mei Lin walked in shortly after. She looked at George suspiciously. You've been coming home later though. George glanced at her. That contradicts grandfather's observation. I mean later after leaving the office earlier, she clarified. That's still contradictory. Mei Lin frowned. You know what I mean. George simply drank his tea. The conversation moved on. But his grandfather noticed something subtle. George had not denied the observation. Asterix developments. Later that morning George met with Shu Ren again. The security director placed a report on the desk. We traced Hengdao Holdings investment chain. And several shell companies. Expected. Shu Ren flipped to another page. But eventually the money leads to a larger investment group. George read the name. Northern Crest Capital. He leaned back slightly. That's interesting. Northern Crest was not an enemy of Asterix. But they had competed in several large acquisitions recently. Do we know their objective? George asked. Not yet. Continue investigating. Shu Ren nodded. There's another detail. George looked up. Hengdao is buying multiple properties in the Nanchao district. For redevelopment. Yes. George tapped the desk lightly. Speed. Very fast. Too fast, George said. Shu Ren agreed. Projects like that normally required months of preparation. Hengdao was moving much quicker. Which suggested something else might be involved. A quiet routine. That night George drove to the old district again. The restaurant was open. Aveline was placing ingredients into storage containers. You're late, she said when he entered. George sat down at his usual table. You're closing soon. In about 30 minutes. That's fine. She nodded and went into the kitchen. This time she brought noodles without asking. You didn't order, George said. You always order this. That's an assumption. Then prove me wrong next time. George ate quietly. Aveline cleaned the kitchen counter while occasionally glancing toward the door. After a while she said. The two men haven't come back this week. The collectors. Yes. That's good. Temporary, she replied. They'll return. George finished the meal. Probably. She leaned against the counter. You come here often. George looked up briefly. You said that already. Yes, but now I'm sure. He didn't answer. Aveline continued. People usually come here once by accident. And then they don't come back. George placed the payment on the table. I prefer quiet places. You've said that, too. He stood and prepared to leave. Before opening the door, he asked something casually. If the landlord forces you to leave, what will you do? Aveline thought about it. Find another place. That's expensive. So is giving up. George nodded slightly. Then he left. Chen Ruizu's concern. The following afternoon Ruaoshui visited Asterix's headquarters again. She walked into George's office carrying a tablet. You've heard about Hengdao Holdings? She asked. Yes. The Chen Group has also noticed them. George gestured toward a chair. Ruaoshui sat down. They're buying property quickly, she continued. Too quickly. That means they're expecting a profit from something else. George nodded. Ruaoshui looked at him carefully. Nanchao District is part of their purchase plan. I know. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You've been going there frequently. George didn't answer immediately. Ruaoshui leaned forward. Is there a reason? There might be. That sounds vague. I'm still observing. Ruaoshui studied him for a moment before smiling slightly. You've developed a habit. George raised an eyebrow. Habits are inefficient. Not always. She stood up. Let me know if Hengdao becomes more interesting. I will. Before leaving she added casually. And next time you go to that restaurant, try ordering something other than noodles. George didn't react. But he remembered the suggestion. Unexpected pressure. 2 nights later George returned to the alley again. This time the restaurant door was open but the atmosphere inside felt different. The 2 debt collectors were there again. The heavier man was leaning against the counter while the tall one spoke to Aveline. We gave you time, the tall man said. I told you I'm working on it. That's not good enough. George entered quietly and sat down. The men noticed him but ignored him for the moment. We have instructions, the tall man continued. If the payment isn't complete by the end of the week, the landlord will terminate the lease. Aveline crossed her arms. That's not how contracts work. It is when lawyers get involved. The heavier man looked at George. You're back again. George didn't answer. Aveline spoke calmly. I'll pay the rest soon. You said that last week. And I meant it. The tall man sighed. 3 days. He turned toward the door. After that, we stopped being polite. Both men left. The restaurant fell silent again. George finished the tea on the table. 3 days. Aveline nodded. I heard him. That's not much time. No. She began wiping the counter again. George watched quietly for a moment. Then he asked. Why continue? She looked at him. Because it's still mine. George stood up. He placed the usual payment on the table. See you tomorrow, she said automatically. George paused briefly before leaving. Yes. Outside the alley lights flickered slightly in the night air. George walked to his car without hurry. Inside the vehicle he took out his phone and made a short call. Shu Ren. Yes, sir. Accelerate the Hengdao investigation. Understood. George ended the call. The situation in that small district was no longer just about a quiet restaurant. Something bigger was forming beneath the surface. And George Wang had just decided to pay closer attention.